Gospel of the Lord. All right, well, we find our way, interestingly, today in the scriptures for the fifth Sunday of the Easter season, when we celebrate Jesus' resurrection, a gospel passage that comes from the 13th chapter of St. John, which is the Last Supper Discourse. So moving back into the Last Supper Discourse, right before Jesus' death, as a way to ponder on what Jesus is doing in the Easter season might seem a little bit unusual, doesn't it? So this is, of course, amongst many lines. We know that there are lots of well-known lines in the Gospels. This is one of them. This is one of Jesus' most famous words, one of his more memorable quotes. It says, "Love one another as I have loved you, so you also should love one another." And he says, this is a new commandment. We ponder on this a little bit because in order to get ourselves a sort of a wraparound of what Jesus means, the first place we might think of is to say, okay, well, what was the commandment before this one? If Jesus is giving a new one, what was the original one? And how come the original one wasn't good enough? Why do we need a better one? The original commandment is one Jesus has already spoken about, even publicly in his ministry, and it's certainly a commandment that any good Jewish person would know. We probably recall these conversations that Jesus will have with the scribes and the Pharisees most often about things of the law. And one of these conversations you remember where they asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Everybody knows what the greatest commandment, or you should know what the greatest commandment is. And so Jesus quotes, as any good Jewish man would do, quotes from two books. Firstly, the book of Deuteronomy, and then the book of Leviticus. And he says, these are the greatest commandments. The first one from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Jesus says this is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second one is like it. And I'm going to read for you the verses that lead up to that second commandment as well. It comes from the third book of the Pentateuch, the book of Leviticus, and we find in chapter 19, it says this, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. And you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people. You shall not stand forth against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Of course, it's that very last line, that very last sentence, which is the one that Jesus quotes very succinctly. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, there in Leviticus, there's context for that. Here's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, there's something really interesting and important that we need to take into account when we think about, all right, here were the original commandments, and why is Jesus giving a new one? The book of Deuteronomy, but especially the book of Leviticus, is probably well known as the least read, most boring book of all the Bible. It's the one that most people don't know about. Because most of the book of Leviticus is about ritual laws and laws of purity in regards to specific things the Levitical priests would do, very specific things for a very small subset of the people about how you prepare this animal for sacrifice or give that offering before the altar and which time of day and how many days and how long and how many times a month. And so it seems like a bunch of small little things. Leviticus is this specific extension of what's already going on about these great laws, like the law of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And that whole book of Leviticus is like an extension of something that God has already done for the people. The law that he gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. And we know what that law was. That law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai was codified in what we call the 10 Commandments. And what were the 10 Commandments? The 10 Commandments were God's response to the people he chose who had just lived in slavery for 4 centuries. The only cultural memory that anybody has ever had from anybody's ancestors ever, in anybody's memory, if you are Hebrew at this time, is that we are slaves. It's what we do, it's who we are. And when God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai for his people, what those 10 Commandments are nothing more and nothing less than, here's how you be a human. That's it. That's the 10 Commandments. Here's how you be a human. They needed to relearn this because for 4 centuries they were treated as less than humans. They saw each other and themselves as less than humans. They had the work of those parts of society that were less dignified than should be for a human. And so they needed to come back to themselves. Ipso facto, the 10 Commandments. There we go. So the Levitical laws,
Dear brothers and sisters in
heard
Christ,
about,
you don't have to thumb through the pages of sacred scripture for too long before you find parallels being drawn between communion with God and sharing of a communal meal.
Because you see
in the
yourself
Gospel of St. Matthew, Jesus himself refers to the kingdom of God as being
Jesus
like a marriage feast thrown in honor of a king's son, to which many are called, but few are chosen.
Jesus has ever said there were.
The same parable is found in the Gospel of St. Luke, where Christ's analogy is to a banquet rather than specifically a wedding feast. This theme is repeated again and again, right through to the final book of the Bible, Revelation, where St. John encounters an angel who instructs him to write of the heavenly banquet.
Those laws sound
Blessed
pretty
are
darn
those
complete
who are invited to the marriage supper
They use a
of the
bunch of
Lamb.
superlatives, don't
Hence,
they?
as we continue our theme of Thanksgiving
from the
as
law that has
disciples
already been
together
given
on
to
the
the
way,
people, that there's
we
nothing
will
left
explore the importance of
to be given. It's like God has already commanded us. You need to hold nothing back. You need to live in the fullness of who you are. You need to treat each other in the fullness of who that other person is, who is also sacred in my image. So we're like, we're already at red line. We're already at 100%. And then somehow God says, but now I'm going to give you a new commandment. So we're like, well, what gives? How can something more and over and above be given to a commandment that already extends to the fullness of who you are? Does this now make a little bit more sense? It almost sounds a little bit confusing to us in this respect, because it's like, well, what's left? There's nothing left. So now see the punchline. Jesus says, this is a new commandment. Meaning I'm asking you to do something that you have not been able to do yet. My new commandment, that you love one another. And then the greatest clause, the greatest clarifier that ever was in the Bible, that you love one another as I have loved you. The reason this is a new commandment is not because God is saying, love one another. He's already given the people that commandment in its completeness, in the fullness of each person's sacred humanity. But he says, now I'm going to do something new, something that hasn't been done yet, but something which from all eternity I've planned and waited to give you so that you can share in this too. All the complete things that you have been given in the fullness of who you are. will now be added unto you in a sort of super capable way to enable you to love in a manner that you have not yet been able to love. Because your call in life, your destiny in life, and my destiny in life, as Jesus reveals it, is precisely this. Not simply that we are to love ourselves and love God and love each other to the fullness of our capacity, but that we are to love ourselves and to love God and to love each other with the fullness of God's capacity. Not in the fullness of what is natural to us, but in the fullness of what is supernatural to us, what is above us. And if that's the case, if that's the truth, if Jesus isn't lying when he gives this commandment, it really helps to contextualize why you're sitting here right now. Why are you sitting here right now? You could be doing anything with your life right now. You're totally free. So why be here, of all things? For this reason. Because even in our own lives, this is kind of what we experience, don't we? In our modern days, we might say this, the younger crowds, hashtag living my best life, right? We kind of all naturally seek this fullness of something, that we know that we don't want to leave anything on the table, and we're like, I'm supposed to be at 100%. I want to live to the max. I need happiness to the full. I need purpose without any emptiness in between. And as we strive to get that, and we might even achieve that in the fullness of our own humanity, and when people get there, guess how they feel? Maybe you have felt this way. I'm doing all the things that I can do. I'm living the best that I know how to live. I'm leaving nothing back on the table. And somehow, why do I feel like it's not enough? How come I sense something deeper that I need? Why do I feel like there's something beyond me or beyond this that I haven't yet achieved yet? And it is because within each human heart is this commandment. Not simply that we live the best of our own lives, but that we actually live the divine life beyond our natural capacity. And when we come to terms with that, when we kind of surrender to that and admit to that and say, okay, how do I do that? Well, that's when it becomes quite clear that I can't actually achieve what's beyond my capacity. I can achieve up to my capacity, but like none of us can really go beyond our own 100%. It's like, here, put 110% of gas in your tank. Well, you can't. You can only put 100% of the tank to make it full. And so we search out the superabundant capacity, the superabundant life that we've been made for, knowing instinctively that the only way that we can reach that capacity is if God himself gives it to us. God himself gives to us the capacity to fulfill the commandment that is new. And this is exactly how he'll describe it himself, right? We heard it in that second reading in the 21st chapter of the book of Revelation. I think that was chapter 21. Let me just double check. No, I lost my page. Whatever chapter it was, I think it was 21. He sits on the throne, and at the consummation of all things, he says, "Behold, I make all things new. I make all things new." Those are just the fancy words for saying, I bring about something that didn't used to be here. I poof something into existence by my own glory and power. And this is what it means to have the divine life, to live in a kind of a super capacity of fullness, to be able to be like God, able to bring about into the world, poof, things that were not there before. We already know how this works, believe it or not, as human beings, because any of you here who are a mom and dad are personally, intimately aware of what that means. When God gives us even that natural power to co-create with him to bring about a life that, poof, really literally never existed before, but now does, and will live on for all eternity, we get our first glimpse of what it means to love as God loves. You come back to this quote and you ask the question, okay, how did Jesus love us? What was it within Jesus that empowered him to do what he did on our behalf? And the context for his own words, we also read in the scriptures. He says, the Father is glorified in me, and I am glorified in the Father. And now I give you this commandment. Jesus loved us by being possessed by the love of his Father. He was filled to the capacity, filled to the infinite brim of the love of his God, of his Father. And it is that love within Jesus that empowered him to pour out his life, to go outside of himself for the good of the one that he loved. And when each of you hold that little baby in your arms for the first time, guess what's instinct for you for the rest of your life? To begin moving outside of yourself and emptying out yourself for good of the one that you love. And that is one way in which God makes things new, isn't it? And so God makes things new by bringing about new humans into the world. And God also makes things new by renewing souls and recreating human souls to be ready for the life of heaven. And this is the life of faith. The recreation of our hearts and our souls. Receiving the love of God so that we can go forth like Jesus, possessed by that love, so that in the overflow of that love beyond our lives, other people catch it and are filled by the same thing, so that they also are renewed. It's why Christianity is the most consoling, encouraging worldview, religion, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, whatever the world might call it. There is no better news than that. Because if he's true, if he's real, if he's not lying to us, and if the example of his life means anything to us, clearly it's this. It's not simply that he gives you the commandment, it's that he is ready to empower you to fulfill the commandment and actually to do it in you, on your behalf, with your cooperation. Here's my fullness. I don't pour it on you like this. I pour it on you like this. And then like this. And then like this. And then like this. And this is how I make new things. This is how I bring about a new creation. When we come to church on Sunday, when we receive Jesus in communion, it is so that the love of God may be in us. And when the love of God is in us, God is doing this again and again and again, over and over and over. So that we may not simply live to the fullness of our human capacities, but that we may each have the truly most abundant life that we were worthy of, which is the divine life of God in you.